You've probably heard people say, oh, she thinks like a lawyer or he thinks like a lawyer. And I got to say, there's something to that. Having been a lawyer now for decades and having been through law school, there is this process that your mind goes through, the way you think goes through when in those 3 years of legal training in law school. I'm not going to say it's like brainwashing, but it does change the way you think. It changes the way you see things. It certainly changes the way when you read something or hear something, the way you think about it. It basically, you kind of focus on what is the core issue. You kind of your brain kind of just eliminates some of the noise and tries to figure out like what's the question here, and how do you resolve it, sort of as quickly and efficiently as possible. And so I think a lot of the skills, sort of the mindset, evolution that you experience in law school, can be very helpful in other areas of your life. I certainly feel that way. And for me, I think about how it helps even in my spiritual life. What it does is, one of probably the biggest things is, my experience as a lawyer, my legal training kind of like elevates my smell tester. Like if someone is advancing a position, whether it's in church or a pastor or a minister on TV or online, or even something in the Bible, and it doesn't sound logical to me, it just doesn't sound rational, like I can't accept it, I don't just kind of like go along with it. To me, it stands out, and I don't accept it. And I think, all right, if it's something that I'm hearing in church or even something in the Bible, maybe I'll come around at some point. But in the meantime, I'm not going to pretend I believe something that I just don't believe. As a lawyer, I can't do that. I took an oath, when I entered the bar, to be honest and maintain truth, and I apply that even to my spiritual life. So, again, I do try to bring the positive aspects of thinking like a lawyer. There's some negative, so I really try to keep a lid on those. But the positive aspects of that to other areas of my life, and particularly my spirituality. And I'm going to share those with you from time to time on the spiritual side, in other areas as well. So what I'm going to talk about today is my prayer life, and how there are certain things that I bring from my either legal training or legal experience to my prayer life that I think are helpful. So, one of those is how I approach God during prayer. And I sort of analogize that to, when I would go to court and have to talk before a judge. And the bottom line is that you got to know your audience. You have to understand who your audience is in every situation. And when you're a lawyer and going into a court, you're talking to a person, to the judge, who has a lot of power. The decision is ultimately theirs. And you need to keep that in mind and pay that person the respect that they're owed, not by virtue of who they are. I don't know, judges personally, but just by virtue of the position they hold. And so I never get, too chummy, or I don't kid around with a judge. Even if the judge has that kind of playful way of talking to myself or opposing counsel, I kind of don't go there. I believe what they say, which is, familiarity breeds contempt. And you could get a judge who likes to be like the star of the show and kidding around and be buddy-buddy. But if you reciprocate that, it doesn't always go well. So, I always keep a sort of a formal, respectful tone with a judge. And I bring that even, in my prayer life. I think to myself, when I'm praying, I'm talking to my Father in heaven, who loves me, but he's also, the supreme spiritual leader of, our entire existence. He created the universe. So I keep that in mind. And again, I'm respectful, and I don't, just in terms of how I communicate with God, I don't think it's good to be too familiar. I think to myself, there have been times at work where I've had to talk to my boss's boss or the CEO of the company or even a board of directors, and I would get so nervous. I'd be so afraid of saying the wrong thing or sounding like I wasn't prepared. And I think I would actually take a step back and I would think to myself, like, the worst that these people can do is fire me, and life will go on. I'll get another job. They don't have that much power over me, and yet I'm like trembling in fear. But when I pray, I don't bring that same level of fear to God. Again, the guy, the being that created the universe. There's a passage in Ecclesiastes in chapter 12, I think it's verse 13, that says, fear God and obey his commandments. So I don't think fear means, you should be panicked or trembling every time you communicate with God. But it means show the right level of respect, that you're talking, again, to the creator of the universe. And so what does that mean? That means, kind of think about what you're going to say and, use a respectful tone when you're talking to God, just like you would if you were talking to a judge or your boss's boss. Don't get too kind of loose, with the way you communicate. Have that requisite level of respect. The second area of my prayer life that I want to share is sort of what I ask for in prayer. Or more precisely, it's what I don't ask for. So I don't bring to God my wish list of all the things I want God to do for me, because I don't think He grants those. I don't think that's the way it works. I don't think God sort of manipulates the facts of our lives and our circumstances. I don't think He, just because we say, God, please, help me get this promotion, or help me recover from this illness. I don't think He does that. I don't think He intervenes in our lives in that way. And this is where I think a lot of my fellow Christians will hear me say that and say, like, well, what are you talking about? That God doesn't answer your prayers in terms of your asks to help you out of scrapes and that sort of thing. Like, that's blasphemy. But I don't worry about the fact that, like, some Christians would have that perspective on this view, because this is where, again, I bring my legal training, my legal thinking, which is, if something doesn't make sense to me, I don't accept it, and I don't feel guilty about it. Like this, if God truly is, like, helping us out of scrapes and manipulating our lives, that runs counter to the whole way God created this world. I mean, He created this world with a lot of hardship and challenges, and sometimes a lot of pain. But that's part of the plan. It's the only way we could grow and mature and become better versions of ourselves, to become more godlike, so that then we can, inherit the kingdom of heaven and truly, experience the joy of all the love that God has as fully formed adults. And I talk about this in somewhat detail in a video I posted a couple days ago. It's called "Some Things Even God Can't Do." So again, I think that the fact that like a pastor or minister or my fellow Christians would look at me and like criticize that view, like, that's okay. I can live with that. So, but what do I ask for in prayer? Well, I ask God to change me, not my circumstances, but to change me. Help me be more patient. Help me to be more kind. Help me to not lose my temper. And also, I ask God, just to communicate with Him better. Sometimes I say, God, please, God, I want to feel your presence. Like, reveal yourself to me. Like, let me know you're here. I want to know you're receiving me. Like, let me hear your words. And also, I ask God to guide my steps. I think God does have a plan for each of us here. So, while I don't think He, again, changes the facts of our lives, I do think He lights our path for us. Like, God, help me understand your plan. Guide me in the direction you want me to go in. So those are my asks. The second category of prayer, of the portions of prayer, is what I'm grateful for. It's like, God, thank you so much for your blessings. And I don't keep it just high level. I actually get into the details of, in the last day or so, usually it's the day before, I think about the day, and I thank Him for, very specifically, the things that I'm just so grateful for, living in my life that sort of came my way. And, I really think that process of thinking about your day and sort of picking out the things that were good, that you're thankful for, it actually gives you a better outlook. It changes the way you think. It makes you more positive. because it makes you kind of always look for the good. Always look for like, well, what was good that happened yesterday, and it kind of keeps you out of the negative side. The big thing I always say thank you for is just that God created us. God, thank you for creating me, because our time here on earth is just a small piece of the eternity that we're going to spend, and that's something that's truly a gift. And then the third part of my prayer is, asking God for forgiveness for my sins. And again, I don't keep that, super high level. I get into the weeds. I think about sort of the day before, what I did wrong, what I can improve on. It's like, God, I indulged in that, and I know that's a sin. So please, help me be stronger. Help me not do that again. Help me to avoid that area, that temptation. So those are the areas. I think it's good when you go into prayer. If you kind of break them down into those three categories, I think you're a lot more effective, and it's just going to sort of help you communicate with God better. And when it comes to prayer, one thing I feel really strongly about is the posture that you need to assume when you're praying. So I believe that you need to get on your knees, and I usually I'm leaning over a chair, and I fold my hands and I bow my head. And I think that's important because, it shows, your commitment to submitting to God's power. Now, I would never bow down to any human being, but, God is our creator and he's our Father in heaven. So I think it's important to, humble ourselves and truly submit to God. And also, when you're on your hands and knees praying, it's easy to stay focused on spiritual matters. I think a lot of people, and I did this for many, many years, you pray at night when you're in bed, like, dear God, maybe you say the Lord's Prayer. And I always start my prayer time with the Lord's Prayer. I did that, when I was a young kid. I do it to this day. But when you're laying in bed, I think you always start out, in prayer, true, like focused on, matters you're bringing to God. But, you tend to drift off more. You start thinking about, the day's events, and then, maybe, I don't know, you start thinking about what you're going to do tomorrow, or your to-do list, or your grocery list, or whatever it is. But when you're on your hands and knees, it's like there's not really much else. You're not going to be down there for like a half hour, right? So you do stay focused, which I think is important. One thing I will admit, something that I'm a little bit ashamed of is, so when my prayer schedule is I read my Bible. I usually read just a few pages, and then I pray, and I get on my hands and knees. But if I hear like my wife or my kids like coming downstairs or like coming toward the room, I kind of get up. Like it's so funny. I don't want them seeing me praying. Now, if they ever ask me, like, when you pray, do you get on your knees, hands and knees and pray? I would say yes, but I just don't want them to see me in that posture. And I'm a little ashamed of that. Like I should be okay with that, but I'm not. So something I'm working on. And then, the last thing I want to talk about in terms of prayer is the time of day. And, you got to pray in whatever time of day works best for you, where you can be most effective in prayer. Now, for some people, that will be, at night after like the day's of events are done, and you're kind of relaxed and you can kind of wind down and just focus on matters of God. That's not for me. That's not for me. At night, I'm tired. I'm kind of, not focused. It's not the time when I could really just give it all to God. For me, it's like first thing in the morning. Like I'm a morning person. That's when I'm sharpest. And that's the time when I'm at my best that I want to give to God. I do that, certainly for prayer. A few years back, I wrote a book, and it's still being published. I have it right here. I keep it right here next to me. It's called The Bible Enter Here. It's a book where I kind of rewrote the key stories and teachings of the Bible, but in a kind of a concise, entertaining, kind of fun way, really geared toward teens and young adults. And when I would write that book, I had a very, very busy job, as I do now. One of these 60, 70, 80-hour week jobs. But I always, I knew I had from 5 in the morning to 6:30 that I could just focus on writing my book. So I did that every morning for like an hour, hour and a half. And now when I record videos, I do it at the same time of day, really early in the morning. And that's when I'm at my sharpest. And again, that's the time I give to the Lord. So in terms of prayer, I hope some of these thoughts, might help you out. I'd love to hear from you. And, if any of this resonated with you, please do hit the subscribe button. And hopefully we'll see you next time. Thank you.